think that, or I hope that through this presentation, I can get some of you caught up or get infected by the phyletic history virus. Um, phyletic history is generally not a very popular subject either in India or in the world. And then why do I want to get into phyletic history and why do I like phyletic history? In 1923, somebody asked the famous British mountaineer George Mallory as to why he wanted to climb Mount Everest. And his famous three words were, because it's there. It's something similar with me. I'm interested in phyletic history because it's there and because it happened. And uh, with respect to phyletic history, how philately began from its early days in the 1860s, um, its early years, and what I hope is currently its middle age, as well as the ups and downs that it has seen over the last 160 years or so, is something which is fascinating and interesting to me, and hence my interest in phyletic history. This particular presentation is all about the biographies of certain early Indian philatelists and dealers who should really not be forgotten because they were the fathers on whose foundations Indian philately is where it is today. When I say Indian philatelists, I mean philatelists who were stationed in India at that point in time. Of course, most of them were Britishers. So let's get into the presentation. The first, so this is going to be the format. To talk about the phyletic scene in the late 19th century. Then I'm going to talk about 6 to 7 different early Indian philatelists and what they contributed to the Indian philately and the philetic literature. And finally, I will talk about a few Indian dealers. I have not been able to trace many of them, but whoever I've been able to trace in the 19th century, I'm going to talk about them. So first, let's start with the Indian philetic scene as it existed in the 19th century. In the winter of 1892, M.P. Castle, who was then one of the world's foremost philatelists, he was also the editor of the London Philatelists and a vice president of the Philetic Society London, came to India. Basically, he was on a tour of the East, and obviously India was part of his itinerary. His first port of call was Bombay, where he met with members of the Bombay Philetic Society, a society that had just been formed a few months earlier. He also met a few dealers. Next, he went to the northwest provinces, where his search for dealers as well as collectors was in vain. Finally, he landed up in Calcutta. That was the city. That was the last city that he visited in India before he moved on to Ceylon. And he met two gentlemen there, two philatelists there, C.F. Larmor and G.J. Hines. And I'll talk about these two philatelists later. He wrote about his experiences, his entire tour of the East in the London Philatelist. And it is very apparent from his writings. If you read his writings, it is very, very apparent that he was much in awe of the Bombay Philatelists as compared to the Calcuttans. Little did he know at that point in time that it would rather be the Calcuttans who will steal the limelight over the Bombayites, and it will be Calcutta who will be ruling the roost as far as Indian philately is concerned for a very long time to come. So, what do we know about Indian philately in the early years? In the early years, probably the green shoots of Indian philately can be traced to the early 1870s, 1880s as the first philatelists, dealers come in. The first philatelist that we know of, the first Indian philatelist that we know of is somebody called G.B. Mannering. I will talk about him in the next couple of slides. The first stamp dealer, probably Universal Stamp Auction from 1878, based in Bombay. And the first journal was already in vogue in 1894. The Philetic Society started to get formed in 1892, with the Bombay Philetic Society being the first, followed by the Bengal Philetic Society and the Philetic Society of Burma in 1894. And finally, the Pan-India, the Philetic Society of India in 1897. The first handbooks of Indian philately were already published by the 1870s. But to be fair, they were basically books connected with the working of the post office rather than books on stamp collecting. If you see the nature of the stamp collectors and the stamp dealers, it is interesting that most of the stamp dealers were in Bombay on the west coast of India. Most were Parsis or Portuguese Indians. On the other hand, most of the serious collectors or the philatelists who made a name for themselves, they were in Calcutta on the east coast of India. And overwhelmingly, as I said, Britishers. Britishers because either they were in India as a consequence of their working in India in either the army or in various government jobs, or as a result of having been born and brought up in India, but very rarely the latter. Let's look at the problems that we find in tracing the early philatelists and dealers. Why is it not easy to talk about them, and why is it not easy, and why little is known about them? The thing is that history records only those who have done certain deeds. Either these philatelists or dealers should have written or should have been written about. And unless that has happened, how does somebody coming 120 years down the line know about them? So at that point of time, most of the, as it is today, that not many people contributed as far as their writings is concerned. In December 1899, there were about 100 plus members of the Philatelic Society of India, but just about 5 or 7 of them were active with respect to their writing, and hence we know about them. It was more of a closed club, not many Indians, and probably philately and stamp collecting was not very high on the priority of the Indian community as such, I guess. As far as dealers are concerned, one way of tracking dealers are through their price list, it's through their advertisements in journals, but unfortunately not many of them have been preserved. One reason is obviously the fact that these are publications of an ephemeral nature, and therefore nobody really keeps them aside. Even if you see the Crawford collection, they have very few, it has very few items with respect to India, hardly anything on the ephemeral side. And the second thing is the climate. The climate is so bad that preserving stuff is really very difficult. So it's again very difficult to track some of the dealers in especially. However, I would like to
ভিডিও চালু ছিল
ও তাহলে এখন
মানে তোমাকে দেখতে পাচ্ছিল হ্যাঁ
can the person please keep it on mute? Yeah, but the study of stamps among those few 5, 7, 8, 10 people did reach standards which were equivalent to or probably exceeded what one might see in the UK or the US. So now let me go into and talk about some of the early Indian philatelists of that particular period. I don't have a photograph of the earliest philatelist Mannering, and these are some of the photographs of some of the other philatelists of that particular period. Maybe I could have added a few more, maybe another 3 or 4 different philatelists. I could not find the photographs. And basically, this is what early Indian philately and early Indian philetic journalism was standing on the shoulders of these few giants of that age. Let me quickly get started with the first philatelist that I want to talk about. His name was G.B. Mannering. If you see, the British have a habit of eating up the W's, as I was told once when I was in the UK, that we love to eat our W's. So we pronounce Mainwaring as Mannering. The W is silent. G.B. Mannering was born in India to British parents. He joined the army at a young age of 16 in 1842. And he was supposed to be somebody who was very adept in languages. Hence, in 1867, he was sent to Darjeeling, which is in the eastern Himalayas, to Upper Bengal to study the local language of Darjeeling and the nearby areas, including Sikkim, which is called the Lepcha language. And he stayed on in that particular area for about 20 years. And he wrote many books as well as dictionaries and books on grammar of that particular language. And he's credited with ensuring that the language was preserved, that it did not die out. So he's so highly regarded by the Lepcha people, even at this point in time, that if you go to YouTube, you can find various videos of him, of the Lepcha people felicitating him For example, last year was his 194th birth anniversary, and various programs were organized on at that point in time. As far as stamp collecting goes, he's probably, as I said, the earliest philatelist that we know about. When he was stationed in Darjeeling in 1871, he brought out a list of postage stamps that were issued by the Indian Post Office. And obviously, he must have had some connection with the Indian Mint or with the stamp office in Calcutta, because his list was so comprehensive that none of the contemporary stamp catalogs of that age had the kind of information that his list had. And this list was printed in one of the most famous journals of that point in time, the Stamp Collectors magazine, in 1874. Mannering was also a stamp collector, of course. He's credited with having brought the iconic 4 Anna's inverted head to the attention of the collecting world. He unfortunately was not a very systematic collector. He was not somebody who was very fond of exhibiting, I guess. At that point in time, people used to have used to collect basis the catalog. Basically, they used to collect one of each stamp as per the catalog and maybe shades. But he was somebody who used to collect many stamps of one single kind. He was somebody who used to buy approval books and just leave them lying around. So he was not a very systematic collector. His collection was sold in 1892 to one Mr. Goodwin Norman. He was another famous collector for about 8,000 rupees. It's not a very small amount, but it's not a very big amount. And the reason why it did not probably fetch the kind of money that it should have is because of the poor state in which it was organized. If you see the image on the right, this is the Stamp Collectors magazine of 1894 January, which published his list. By that point of time, the lieutenant colonel had become a colonel, and finally, at the time of his retirement, he had become a general. My next philatelist, who I would like to talk about, is G.J. Hines. G.J. Hines was born in India, but he went to England to get educated. He came back in 1857 and he worked in the Presidency Bank of Bombay. But the bank folded up after some time. The bank failed. And G.J. Hines then joined the post office. He worked his way all the way up to attain the post of Deputy Director General of the Indian Post. As far as his stamp collecting goes, he started collecting stamps only in 1883, maybe in his middle age. He must have come across G.B. Mannering's list of postage stamps. He was pretty intrigued with it, and he corrected it, updated it. He sent it to De La Rue for corrections, and he published it as a post office document, as a document of the Indian Post Office the next year in 1884. A second edition came out in 1885. Apart from publishing probably India's first stamp catalogue, G.J. Hines was also the biggest collector of India at that point in time. He had about 25,000 specimens of stamps in his collection, and at that point of time, people used to talk about, like children did in our childhood. People used to talk about stamps in terms of how many specimens of stamps that does a particular person have in his or her collection. The more, the better, or the more, the bigger collector he or she is. So he had about 25,000 specimens of stamps. He had sheets and sheets of the first issues of 1854-55, including one full sheet of the 9½ Arches. G.J. Hines was also instrumental in building up a collection for the government of India. Nobody knows where it is currently. He himself had predicted at that point of time that once he retires, the collection will just disappear or it will just be thrown away somewhere. He was the founding president of the Philatelists Society of Bengal, but he just retired from post office after 6 months and he went back to England. So his presidency of the Philatelists Society of Bengal lasted just about 6 months. Once he went back to England, he participated in a few activities of the Royal Philatelic Society or the Philatelic Society London, as it was called at that point in time. But he resigned in early 1901, and we do not hear about him after that. This particular screen shows you the first and the second. On the left, you have the first edition of Heinz catalog, and on the right, you have the second edition of his catalog. Both the editions are pretty similar to each other, except that the second edition has these ruled spaces where specimens of postage stamps, postcards, etc. could be put. Can we say that this was India's first stamp album as such? Possible. I will now introduce you to the father of philatelic journalism in India, C.F. Larmor. This particular title was given to Larmor by another great, probably the greatest philatelist of that era, Charles Stuart Wilson. Larmor was born in UK. He was educated in UK, but he came to India in 1869 and he set up his own business. Some of you who track the London Philatelists might know his son A.C. Larmor, who was the editor. He was a famous philatelist, and he was also the editor of the London Philatelists during the World War II days. Larmor started collecting as a boy, and Larmor's, if you see his writing style, it's quite humorous. The way he wrote was extremely witty and informal. And in one of his recollections, he writes that he started collecting stamps as a boy of 5 or 6, probably, when one of his friends, who was from the country of Chile, he had some Chilean stamps with him, and he demanded the 2-penny peppermint drops that Larmor had in his pocket. So they decided to barter and exchange, and that's how Larmor started collecting stamps. He really restarted collecting seriously only after 20 years of coming to India in 1889, and his main interest lay in the stamps of Great Britain, Australia, Mauritius, Ceylon, and particularly Portuguese Indies. He was not a very big stamp collector. He was not a very famous stamp collector, but really it was because of him that Indian philatelic literature and Indian philately, from that perspective, saw a push. He edited India's second stamp magazine, The Philatelic World, for 28 out of the 32 issues that came out. He also edited the Philatelic Journal of India for the first 1.5 years. And he served on the council of the Philatelic Journal of Philatelic Society of Bengal, as well as the Philatelic Society of India, for quite some time. Unfortunately, we do not know much about his last days. He abruptly resigned from the Philatelic Society of India in 1909, if I'm not wrong, and he went back to England. And we do not hear about him anymore. This is the Philatelic World. This is the magazine which was edited by Larmor for most of its existence. The second magazine in the world, the Philatelic World, along with the Philatelic Journal of India, was probably one of the best magazines, not in India, but in the world. One of the best magazines in the English language in the world, whether it's in the UK or the US or anywhere else. If you read and if you look at the Philatelic World and its successor, they are just world class. Obviously, it benefited from the editorship of Larmor as well as of Corfield. We will look at Corfield in the next slide. It was really a high quality journal. If you see, it was obviously the official organ of the Philatelic Society of Bengal, but it also had interviews with leading Indian philatelists. The first one is about G.J. Heinz. And if you remember, in one of my earlier slides, I said, how does history record a philatelist? It's because if they have written something or if they have been written about. And while G.J. Heinz did not write anything, while G.J. Heinz did not write anything, he was not known because of his writings, but he was known because Larmor wrote about him. And then it contained a series of London papers by the famous Major E.B. Evans. It contained reports of what's happening in other philatelic magazines, notes and records, auction records. And since it was the official organ of the Philatelic Society of Bengal, it also carried the minutes of the meetings of that particular philatelic society. Now, how did the Philatelic World close down? It did not close down on its own. It closed down only because in 1897, the Philatelic Society of India was formed, and the Philatelic Society's journal, the Philatelic Journal of India, came into being. I think I have with me here, just to show you, I think it's usually very difficult to show in presentations, but this is the Philetic World. Pretty small, right? I mean, when I ordered it from the US some time back, so these are the 2 volumes of the Philetic World, 24 issues. But the last 8 issues are pretty difficult to find because they were never bound as a volume. And as compared to that, and I'm going to come to the Philetic Journal of India, you can see the Philetic Journal of India. It's almost double the size of the Philetic World. And that's why I say that the Philetic Journal of India for the first 15 years or so was probably the best magazine in the world, on par with probably the London Philatelist and maybe the Philetic Record. Let's come to William Wilmot Corfield. William Wilmot Corfield was born in Birmingham. He was educated in in the UK, but like most people, he came to India for his fortune, I guess. He was an accountant by profession, and he came to India in 1886, sorry, but probably he didn't like the climate too much. He went back in 1889. He came back in 1893, and when he came this time around, he stayed for 18 years. Corfield started collecting once again as a boy. He, along with Lamore, were amongst the earliest stamp collectors from the early 1860s. He claimed that he never sold a single stamp of his, which means that his collection, part of which was inherited by him from his elder brother, was one of the oldest existing stamp collections at that point in time in the world. Along with Lamore, he edited the Philetic World for about 17 issues. Sometimes he edited it singly as well. He also edited a few issues of the Philetic Journal of India. But what Corfield was famous for is for being not a prose writer, but a poet. He was a poet amongst philatelists. So if you see the Philetic World as well as the Philetic Journal of India, many of his articles are under the pseudonym Dark. Dark, of course, means post in Hindi. And many of them are not in prose form, but they are in verse. So you have somebody who was a poet and not a writer, normal writer. He was the co-author with Crofton on the fiscal and telegraph stamps of India. And he also wrote 2 books on verses, on philetic verses, which were published as Dark Dicta and More Dark Dicta. Corfield, along with Lamore, was one of the founder members of the Philetic Society of India, and he served in a variety of positions before he also resigned at the same time as Lamore in 1909. So I guess you can say that Lamore and Corfield were kind of joined at the hip. But Corfield did not fade into obscurity. After the death of M.P. Castle, there was at least one issue which he brought out, while his name is not mentioned as an editor. At least one issue was brought out in that particular period by him, where he was probably the one who was instrumental in ensuring that monthly issue was published. So these are some of the books of Corfield. On the left, you have a normal fiscal book. What is more interesting is things on the right: Dark Dicta and More Dark Dicta. Verses written in Calcutta. Just before he went back to England, these were published in 1910 and 1911. Now we come to probably the father of Indian philately, Sir Charles Stewart Wilson. Charles Wilson was once again born in the UK. He studied there. He gave the entrance exam to the Indian Civil Services in 1883, and he was posted in India in 1886. He occupied a variety of posts in the government services before he joined the Postal Department in 1892. In the Postal Department, he went up all the way up to the highest post, which is the Director General of Indian Post. He was the Director General from 1906 to 1912. And once the Postal Department and the Telegraph Department had been merged, he was the Director General of Posts and Telegraphs for 1 year between 1912 and 1913. He retired in 1913, went back to England, and he was the Assistant Secretary in the Munitions Department from 1915 to 1921. As far as philately is concerned, obviously he was, like most schoolboys, He started collecting as a schoolboy, but he bartered away his stamps for some books of John Ruskin. It might not be a bad idea, because probably reading those books brought into him the sense of penmanship which so pervades his writings. He renewed stamp collecting in 1894, at along almost the same time when Heinz was retiring and going back to England. He joined the Philatelic Society of Bengal, and post office guys were probably held in great honor at that point in time. He became the president of the Philatelic Society of Bengal just 20 days later. He was instrumental in forming the Pan India Philatelic Society of India. He was its president till 1905, before he had to give it up after becoming the Director General. He was also the editor of the Philatelic Journal of India for quite a few years, for almost 6 years, between 1898 and 1904. If he were not there, probably the fledgling society and the fledgling journal could have died away. Wilson collected stamps of India. He collected stamps of Hong Kong, Strait Settlements. Ceylon was a perennial favorite. Portuguese Indies was a perennial favorite. But later on, he started collecting stamps of Holland and its colonies, as well as Japan. Wilson is also known to have authored the telegraph section of Hosberg's monumental The Postage and Telegraph Stamps of British India in 1907. Obviously, I forgot to mention, and last but definitely not the least, he was one of the initial signatories to the role of Distinguished Philatelist in 1921, the first year in which the role was inaugurated. This is the Philatelic Journal of India. I gave a few snippets of the Philatelic World earlier, and this is the Philatelic Journal of India, one of the best stamp magazines of that age. It was solely because of Wilson that it somehow managed to survive into the 20th century and flourish thereafter. Basically, Stuart Wilson was responsible for bringing it up to the category of one of the best magazines in the world. The journal had the usual stuff, obviously, but it was one of the first journals to talk about or to have articles on these native stamps of India. A lot of things which we know today is because of this particular journal. At that point of time, many of the native state stamps had a pariah status. I mean, they were considered to be manufactured stamps. They did not have, they were not looked at respectively by collectors. But it was this journal which brought about the respectability that these stamps needed. Stuart Wilson himself, excuse me, Stuart Wilson himself collected Indian stamps surcharged for use in the convention or in some of the native states, the so-called convention state stamps, and hence he started writing about these stamps in his magazine, which encouraged other people to write about their other fiduciary states here. A lot of collectors of a lot of philatelists of the Philatelic Journal of the Philatelic Society of India were also collectors of not just India but world over, because that was the age of generalism, right? I mean, people used to collect not just India; they used to collect stamps from all across the world, and hence, in this particular journal, in the early years, you see original articles on the stamps of Chile to Peru to New South Wales and so on. And if you see, as I showed you, each of these journals, this is from 1899, each of these journals was extremely heavy, something like 350 to 450 pages per volume, which means it was about something like anywhere between 35 to 50 pages per issue, something which was not very easy to do, something which is not very easy to do even today. And as I told you that Stuart Wilson was very interested in the stamps of India surcharged for use in the native states. 6 native states used those stamps. He wrote about them in the Philatelic Journal of India, and later on they were published in book form. And on the extreme right, you have US postage stamps of British India by Hosberg. This part 2 was written by Stuart Wilson along with Crofton. We will talk about Crofton sometime, maybe not today, but sometime in the future. Crofton was another interesting character. Now we come to another strong philatelist. Stuart Wilson was obviously living in 1921 when he was called upon to sign the role of distinguished philatelist. Unfortunately, Sir David Mason had passed away, and hence he was one of the fathers of philately who were inscribed on the roll of distinguished philatelist in 1921. So what do we know about Mason? He was once again born in Scotland. He had a stamp boyish collection. He apprenticed as in the banking business, and he rose all the way to become the managing director of the Bank of Punjab. He was a pretty rich person. He was also a person of many facets. He was the ADC to the to the Viceroy of India and the Commander-in-Chief. He was the Lieutenant Colonel in the 1st Punjab Volunteer Rifles and member of the Council of the Lieutenant Governor of Punjab. And he held some positions in the Masonry as well. So basically, he was a pretty busy man. How did he get into stamp collecting? In 1895-96, when he was almost 50 years old, he was looking at his daughter's collection, and that got him set into stamp collecting once again. Within 3 to 4 years, he had built the best collection of Jammu and Kashmir and Afghanistan. He had written articles about them, and handbooks were also published by him. I will just talk about the stamps of Jammu and Kashmir in the next slide. He was also a very important part of the Philatelic Society of India. He was its treasurer, he was its president, and when he died, he was also its vice president. This is the stamps of Jammu and Kashmir, part 1 and part 2. This is the book which exposed many of the forgeries of the circular forgeries of Jammu and Kashmir and led to a partial rewriting of the Stanley Gibbons catalog. Why did Mason get into Jammu and Kashmir? I mean, it's an extremely difficult country, right? A difficult place to collect, difficult region to collect. Even Afghanistan, it's a pretty difficult region to collect. The reason for at least Jammu and Kashmir was that Mason used to spend his summers in the Vales of Kashmir, and hence he loved the region, and he decided to start collecting its stamps. That was the reason. And his Kashmir collection, as I said, was the best in the world, and it won the gold medal in the international exhibition at Manchester in 1899. Now we come to some of the early dealers. I think I'm right on cue. Some of the early dealers, these are some of the advertisements of the early dealers taken from journals, the early journals like Indian Philatelists, the first journal from India, the Philatic World, Indian Postage Stamp News, Philatic Journal of India, and so on. So these were some of the advertisements that were given in those journals, and that's how we are able to trace that these firms and these people existed at that point of time. Many of them dealt in Indian native states, but at the same time, many of them also dealt in India and foreign countries. The first stamp dealer, probably, as I mentioned, Universal Stamp Exchange from 1878 from Calcutta. And then you have a number of stamp dealers. If you see, most of them are from Bombay. Bombay Philatic Company is another stamp dealer owned by some Portuguese Indians. They celebrated their 100th year in 1989. I'm not sure where the family is at this point in time, but if you search on the internet, you will find one part of the family in the US, in New Jersey, where they sell new issues. And I'm now first going to talk about ND. Partly auctioneer was Lamo. Just about 20 collectors and 3 dealers attended this particular auction on 15th of September 1894. So while the Philatic World, which was the proprietor's newspaper, felt that it was a big success and things happened, high prices prevailed, the Bombay journals, which were always in conflict with the Calcutta ones, said that it was a rather poor show. So these are the auctions of B. Gordon Jones. I come to my, I think it's about 6:45 right now, and I come to, and this is my last slide. As I mentioned in my first slide, one of my first slides, that there are difficulties in tracking some of these early Indian philatelists and dealers. It's not easy to find out about them. because we don't have the resources to search. I will be very happy if I can hear from any of you who has anything to contribute to philetic history, and maybe one day I will be able to write upon it and get it published. Thanks a lot for attending this presentation. Thanks a lot for your presence, for your time. And I now leave the floor open for questions, if any.